Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, as always, curated by Monocle Solutions. This week, we lift the lid on the contract between the state and taxpayers. Well, every year since 1977, the Free Market Foundation has marked what it calls Tax Freedom Day. It's the symbolic date on which the average South African has finally earned enough to pay the year's tax bill and can begin working for themselves again. It is, of course, a metaphor. No individual taxpayer literally hands over every rand until that day. But as a way of illustrating the size of the state's claim on the national income, it's definitely a very useful and provocative marker. Now, in 2025, South Africa's Tax Freedom Day fell on the 16th of May, meaning that the average South African effectively worked 136 days to fund government spending. According to the FMF, the broader tax burden had risen from around 30% of GDP in 1995, when Tax Freedom Day fell on the 23rd of April, to almost 37% of GDP last year. This year, Dr. Richard Grant has again calculated Tax Freedom Day for 2026, and the question isn't simply whether the date has moved earlier or later. I think the deeper question is whether South Africans are getting a credible return on what is now one of the country's most important economic relationships, that between taxpayers and the state. Dr. Richard Grant joins us now. Richard, welcome. Let's just start with a basic explain and the concept itself. Did I get it right? What exactly is Tax Freedom Day and how do you calculate it?
Yeah, if you look at the amount of tax burden that is accumulated during the year, and then divide that by the gross domestic product, GDP, that will give you an estimate of what that number is. I use total expenditure for general government. And the reason I do that is to capture the effects of the increase in the debt burden, which really translates into future tax burden. So that's the present value of that. And plus it captures the inflation tax, which doesn't show up in the direct revenues.
Now, looking at your op-ed in Business Day last year, I just drew it up ahead of this conversation. If you look at that historical shift from when government statistics are revised, Tax Freedom Day is obviously, as you say, based on government expenditure and GDP data. Obviously, that can change based on when those government statistics are revised. Why is that methodological point important here?
It can cause fluctuations. And for example, the date that I've estimated now is for this year is May 22nd, and I revised the past, I think 4 years have changed. And in fact, for 2024, I predicted it would be May 20th. Last year, I revised it down. I think it was to May 16th or 17th, and now I've put it right back up. It's back up to May 20. So as you get the GDP figures coming in a little different timing than the updated expenditure numbers. So that can make a fluctuation, but it's as far as the bigger story here that you're more interested in is like, what are we getting for all of our government spending and taxing? That story is still rather stark and very clear. The trend has been upward over the past 30 years is what I really published. And that has significance. One of the things I did, just a quick and easy correlation, the greater the share of the GDP taken up by government, the slower will be the growth in GDP, which really means slower income growth.
And that's why that shift, I think, in the longer term view is, we don't want to quibble around decimal points effectively when we talk about a couple of days here or there. But the tax burden rising from around 30% of GDP in 1995 to almost 37% of GDP, as you've just said, that translates into an economic reality where, economic growth does slow. On the back of that, why is that? Maybe you could just explain that to listeners in a way that makes sense for those who aren't steeped in economics.
Well, if we take it down to the individual level, think about the spending, your spending priorities in your household. You start with the most important things. First of all, what do you need to survive? What do you need then to have a reasonable standard of living? And once you've gone down that, at some point you'll say, no, I need to save for the future, which is an important factor as well in your household. And the more things you spend upon, the more you tip into the non-essentials, call them luxuries. And we all know people who just have to have those luxuries, and then they find themselves, no matter how high their incomes are, they find themselves in financial trouble. And that happens with governments. As we shift government spending, it goes beyond priorities of let's say, the judiciary, policing, national defense, diplomacy. Those kinds of things obviously would come first because you've got to protect us overall. But as you go beyond that, you're going to your next best, your next most valuable uses. So if you keep going, look at the logical progression here. You're getting into territory that you could consider it to be luxury spending by the government. Nice to have, but if spending on those things, such as, let's say, the social grants, where you're not getting productive activity from it, if the government builds a bridge, at least that gives productive services over many years. But if you're putting more money into activities that don't produce and don't enable you to grow and have income, first of all, in your households, and then from which then more tax money would be available with which you can finance that spending. So what's really happening is that you're taking money out of the private sector, okay, and the more you take, the more you get into taking away the most productive spending.
Exactly.
And then you're shifting it in to government spend, the increasing government spending, it becomes less and less productive. That's the problem.
Yeah. And I think, it's often a debate that we have in South Africa where some, particularly on the left of the economic and political spectrum, might say, well, South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. And, the counter argument would be that without a large redistributive state, inequality and poverty would be worse. But the problem is we can't, as a country, redistribute successfully if we're not growing fast enough. So you've got to get that balance right between, not taking too much and not taking so much that you can't reinvest back into those productive sectors of the economy, the network industries that enable faster growth, things like infrastructure. And the problem is that in South Africa, it looks like we tax too much on the one hand, and then we get too little economic and social return from what we already tax on the other. But I just want to get your sense on the dilemma that faces the South African state at the moment, because it seems to me that we've built a dependency through our tax and redistribution and social grant system that the current government doesn't know how to kind of get itself out of the cul-de-sac, so to speak. How does one start reversing these years of kind of tax and redistribution back into more productive parts of the economy that can get growth going again? Because we've been stuck in this low growth trap for well over a decade.
Well, certainly the government spending, what we can see and what I detect in the data is that the net effect, or you might say the net benefit, is negative, where people would actually be better off if we had more voluntary ways of taking care of those who are, say, unemployed. And in fact, I think the unemployment rate is, part of the reason that it's so high is precisely because of government priorities being, you might say, overextended. But now that I'm on priorities, let me make the case even more stark. The resources are being drained out of those core essential services that governments are supposed to be offering. So if you have a weakened policing, weakened judiciary, those kinds of services. What about infrastructure? How safe is it to be out driving, or say, a big rig truck moving goods between different locations? How safe is that nowadays? Can that be done? So if you're neglecting those things, then that makes it even more frivolous to be attempting to expend taxpayer resources on those, what I call luxury goods, government luxury goods. So it is a real problem. And I think we need to look at the net benefit. I know it looks nice. And, let's say a more prosperous society and economy might be able to get away with that because they have more left over anyway.
Yeah.
But in South Africa, you're just not going to grow and achieve those levels by getting ahead of yourself, okay? Living beyond the government's means, if you
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. How do you distinguish between a legitimate tax burden in a developmental state and an extractive burden in a state that no longer delivers the basics? Because I think many South Africans would say, well, I pay tax, then I pay again for private security and private healthcare and private schooling, inverters, boreholes, insurance against state failure, all of it really. So how should we think about that double payment problem within the broader concept of tax freedom?
Again, to make a move from one situation to another, you can't just suddenly pull pull the social grants away from people. You've got to be very careful, do it slowly. You want to maintain the current social cohesion such as it is, and then improve it. So emphasis has to be put upon taking care of some cultural things such as culture, making opportunities more available. One thing I did not mention is regulation. Heavy regulations. The more free businesses are from, you might say, again, they're sort of luxury regulations where when you use regulation to attempt to redistribute opportunity, let's say, that again will prevent people from acting in the most creative way and most cooperative way. Okay, you bring too much legalism into the workplace and into daily life, really, as well. So, in other words, to look to the future, to give people opportunity, to be really more, that is, to have a regulatory and spending structure that is more amenable to human life. That's really what it is. So, you have to facilitate cooperation. And that alone could bring down the unemployment rate by a magnitude, an order of magnitude. So, but the spending as well, it has to be shifted into more important things.
It's probably been one of the biggest disappointments so far of the government of national unity, in that we haven't really had the various political parties sit down and have this kind of economic debate and discussion to say, well, how are we going to reignite growth? What do we agree upon? What are the regulations that are choking growth? And what is the ideological luxury that is holding us back? I sometimes look at the Starlink debate that we're currently having in South Africa through that lens, where you look at the possibility of licensing Starlink, not saying it can't be licensed. I mean, it operates in 160 countries around the world. They don't see a sovereignty risk. They just license very smartly. And we have equity equivalent programs that the automotive industry has used, but we seem beholden to a very narrow ideological view on ownership. And I was interviewing a founder of an AI diagnostic startup that can detect tuberculosis using this AI stethoscope. The technology really sits in the cloud, though, so you need, in order to get the benefit of that technology, broadband infrastructure in rural clinics in remote places, something that Starlink would be ideally suited to. And we lose 54,000 people every year to tuberculosis. A lot of that because we don't detect it early enough, because it's not like it isn't treatable. So you're talking thousands of lives that potentially could be saved, yet we sit with legislative blinkers on, so to speak. It's easy for the debate to become moralistic, though. Taxpayers versus beneficiaries, rich versus poor, state versus market. But really, the real issue is growth, isn't it? If South Africa were growing at 4 or 5%, I think Tax Freedom Day would look and feel very different. So as someone who looks at our growth conundrum from the outside, Dr. Grant, what can we do differently to reignite growth if you were advising the government of national unity?
The path has to be one where agreement can be achieved. So to the extent that ideologies are hard to change, that's going to be part of the reality. But I would start putting the emphasis on allowing those things that might be beneficial. You want the net benefit. Another way of saying that would be, remember that the tide lifts all boats. So we shouldn't argue about who's on the top deck of the ship and who's down below, but rather, hey, we're all going up. And the harder everybody fights to get on top, the more likely it is that ship will tip over, perhaps. And it's just not going to work. Everybody's going down. Or to put it more gently, it would be slower progress, okay, less stable cruise. And that's really what we're facing. So a lot of it is an educational matter. And just recognizing that the way that government is conducted and the way of getting agreement, okay, rather than having, again, I'm not pushing a perfect here's the perfect solution, but rather saying, here's what can be achieved given the current political structures.
Yeah.
And knowledgeable people can make those adjustments.
Again, it's, working within the real politic that has been created by years of ideological shibboleths that have been built up that are going to be very difficult to dismantle. I think a major part of the fiscal conversation will be imposed upon us because it's no longer just tax versus services, it's tax versus interest. How much of the taxpayer's burden is now being absorbed by debt service costs?
Oh, I believe interest is now one of the largest standalone items on the budget. It has been for a while. So yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier, where you need to include all of that expenditure because that does translate into a tax burden. So you are adding to your problems. Okay, you can't borrowing money doesn't make you richer unless you are able to use that money to invest in something that will produce more income in the future, okay, or greater social cohesion. So that's the problem there. So yes, interest is growing. It's one budget item, but all you're doing is servicing the debt that you created in the past. And every time a budget deficit is run, I think the budget deficit will be around 4% of overall spending this year. That's just compare that to the inflation rate. You can see where this is going.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's the cruelest part of the fiscal trap. Taxpayers pay more, but a rising share, as you say, goes not to new services, but to servicing yesterday's deficits. And I think when interest payments crowd out spending on policing and infrastructure and education and healthcare, Tax Freedom Day becomes a measure of past policy failure as much as current tax pressure. Do you think South Africa is approaching a point where fiscal consolidation becomes unavoidable, regardless of the political appetite?
Well, that does happen. I've seen that happen in countries where pretty much the bankers, the bond market will tell you make some changes or you're going to have some serious problems, right? You hear that discussion coming up every time there's a worry about South Africa's debt being downgraded. What's the bond rating? And that's a real message. People who are voluntarily lending money are being very careful in that, and they want to know how likely am I to get every cent back that I put into it. So that's a thing. On the other side, once you've elected your government officials, they then can impose these taxes and the spending on you. So you have to watch out for that. And one thing I didn't mention specifically was the structure of the tax. It's one thing to look at the total tax revenue that comes in, but how you obtain that tax revenue matters as well. If you have a wide tax base where everybody pays a very low rate, that gives you a different outcome than when you try to concentrate all of the tax payments, get all the tax revenue from just a few businesses or people. In other words, a narrow tax base. That requires higher tax rates, and it's that marginal tax rate. Everything we do is sort of taking that next step. How much does it take to earn that next rand, and how much do you get to keep? The higher that rate goes, the less incentive any producers or creators have to do that. They at some point they will say, no, I'm going to do something else or take some leisure time. Again, doing something other than work that really will benefit my life more.
Yeah, and we've, I think, already seen that with the Laffer curve showing that the golden geese in South Africa, those who are fortunate to have jobs and be taxed at the higher marginal rate, have been plucked to the point of hissing. And tax systems ultimately run on trust. Citizens comply not only because SARS is effective, and it's ironic that it's one of the more capable parts of the state, but it does create a paradox. You've got this highly effective revenue service funding a frequently ineffective delivery state, but we'll park that. But that social contract exists between taxpayers and the state because they believe the system has legitimacy. How damaged would you say that legitimacy is becoming in South Africa, given the extent of state failure, particularly at a local government level?
That is a very important thing. Yeah, I know at the local level, there can be a lot of complaints about infrastructure maintenance, service provision, those kinds of things. If those are not done, as you mentioned earlier, many people are supplying a lot of those things privately. Yeah, so that breaks down trust. And in general, if you look at let's say, heavy regulation, the more regulations people face each day, so they're, at times you're not even sure, am I obeying the law or not? It gets very difficult to know for sure. The same thing with the spending. It gets to a point where you struggle day to day to have anything left to save, and you start to lose respect for anyone who's doing that to you, which in this case would be the government, and you start losing respect for the law, and you start looking for ways to hide income from them. Okay, not necessarily illegally, but as you mentioned, the Laffer curve. Actually, Art Laffer's a colleague of mine. He recognized that you get to a certain point, you get less revenue from trying to tax people more. They legally shift their activities away from taxable events that are going on. So yeah, that's an extremely important thing to look at. But it's actually a general phenomenon. It's not just tax revenue, but just respect for law and order. And again, people need to pay attention and make sure people avoid crime and avoid deceiving one another.
It's not surprising then, Professor Grant, that we are seeing the rise of the illicit economy in an environment that you've just described. We're seeing the rise of that economy in illicit tobacco, in illicit sales of diesel, and increasingly illegal mining in Zamazamas in and around the Witwatersrand areas. We're seeing it in all parts of the economy that are moving into illicit activities. Given what you've just described, that would be the expected outcome.
That is what we see. And that's true, again, everywhere in the world. But once you lose that cultural stigma against committing crimes or against fraud, those kinds of things, once you lose that, it's hard to get back. So you've got to create the conditions whereby people will respect the law. If it's too onerous, that will just make it more difficult. Now, if people can prosper legally, then you'll find that it tips the balance. Why take the risk of being involved in crime or cheating someone when you know that you could make a decent living? And you will find that does build a much happier culture where you can trust people. So I know that's a big thing to ask for. And once you've lost it, again, look at it as a general thing and sort of manage that and put the government resources where they are most needed, not in what will buy the extra vote. I think a political party that does that will find eventually their support is going to shrink. Okay, and I think we're seeing that actually happening.
Yeah, absolutely. 30 years of trying the same thing and expecting different results. So ultimately, it impacts the bread and butter issues of ordinary voters much more than historical liberation alignments and ideology. And it's good to see. Some might say it's happening too slowly. Let's talk about one of the elephants in the room when it comes to regulation and BEE in particular. It does feel like in South Africa, in the public square, we're having a much more frank and honest debate around the cost of this policy and the trade-offs, because everything does come with trade-offs. The president stood up in Parliament the other day and said, no, BEE has been unequivocally good for economic growth, and those who criticize it are just wrong. What are your thoughts on the impact that this policy has had on the South African economy? And if you were advising the Minister of Finance, what would you advise him to do with it going forward? Keep it, scrap it, amend it?
To use your words, I'd scrap it. You might want to wind it down, but in essence, what you've got to decide is, at what point do we decide that apartheid is over and that we now need to move on together, working together, cooperating? Now, if you use government to force people to have relationships that are not natural to them, not productive, or not even happy, you're going to create all kinds of perversions in the system. Well, actually, you'll lose production for one thing. But I have witnessed in person, in Johannesburg, I've witnessed what happens when that kind of affirmative action, you might say, is imposed or is attempted, even in the private realm. And that what ends up happening is that people are promoted beyond their ability. They necessarily fail. And then when that happens, they become bitter. They might have lost the time where they could have been learning how to do those tasks. And I'm actually referring to education as well at the university level, where I have witnessed that happen, where students have lost a year finding out that, hey, maybe I wasn't ready to be in university, but because of my race, someone felt obligated to put me into that seat in the classroom. And it's a tragedy to watch that happen because they could have used that year for so much greater growth in their personal lives. And to put that into the workplace, it's the same thing. Again, watch certain people who would have made it no matter what. They were jumping from company to company, in a bidding war to see who can have someone to make their diversity numbers look better. And that's, again, it hurts both sides. So you really have fewer businesses functioning than you would have. They are structured differently. You have redundant people there just to fill some government, a checkbox, that on some government regulation. They do need to get over also the ideology of all of this. The reality doesn't care what our ideologies are.
Yeah.
That's why you best not have, be locked into one. Pay attention to how the world really works. And, it does require one to speak bluntly. This is what's true. If you really want to help people you claim to be helping, then let them be free to interact, as real adults and make deals with one another.
It's very similar to what the coach of the highly successful Springbok rugby team said when he first took over the reins. And in tackling this idea of quotas and transformation in sport and in rugby, and he said it does so much more damage to a player's confidence if you select them on the basis of their race because you want to fast track some idea around representativity and transformation. And if they're not ready for it and they don't perform, you will set them back and potentially scar them for life and their confidence. And as we know at elite level sport, that confidence and what happens between 9 or 10 or 11 inches between the ears is often the difference between elite level athletes and those who can't make it. I really hope the GNU does start opening space for this very important conversation. I know the President of the United States tried to open up space for that, and we've had our own issues in trying to find each other diplomatically as a country around issues on transformation. It'll be very interesting to see what the new ambassador, Rolf Mayer, manages to achieve on that front. But if we can't have the conversation internally as a country, diplomatically, it's very difficult to have that conversation. Just lastly, Professor Grant, if you're advising the finance minister and areas where we could cut expenditure and you prioritize expenditure restraint and cutting our fiscal cloth accordingly, where's the one area that could really have the most outsized return? Is it on the bloated public service? Often it's pointed to as the one area of public expenditure that needs serious reduction.
That is one point that, yes, I was going to do some writing on that in the future. And I believe that the fastest growing item now in the budget is actually employment by the government. So, it's that bureaucracy is growing. Not that bureaucracy is bad. We need it. The rules must be followed. We can't have people getting out of control. But the point is, what are they actually adding, and how much of that is in the realm of patronage? Just call it what it is. And it also makes the GDP numbers look higher than they actually are compared to the amount of productivity that you are getting as well. So at least in the short run, you can see it might make GDP look higher. So I would certainly be more careful, make sure that those who are employed in government agencies and departments should be more productive. Make sure that what they are doing is actually helpful. Avoid getting involved in, again, what I keep calling luxury goods, or sort of these not the highest priorities, and put a lot more effort into getting a grip on the management of, say, police services and the judiciary, and make sure that is all running well. You focus on those things. Oh, the other thing that I mentioned earlier was infrastructure. Okay, where that's at whichever level of government is required for that, then you want to focus on those things. Anything that's in the realm of redistribution, again, very gently, you need to put a limit on that and make sure that it's not draining resources from all those other things, because that just magnifies the problem. It's not just that taxpayer resources are being shifted into lower productivity activities, it's that they're actually now being shifted out of the highest priority activities.
Yeah.
So the government ends up not doing anything correctly.
Excellent points. Thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there. That was Richard J. Grant, Professor of Finance and Economics at Cumberland University in the Tennessee and Senior Consultant for the Free Market Foundation on Tax Freedom Day for 2026. A symbolic date, yes, but I think one that raises a very real question, not only how much South Africans pay, but what they receive in return, because the real debate isn't about whether we get taxed or don't get taxed. It's really whether South Africa can rebuild a fiscal bargain in which citizens fund a capable state, that growth broadens the base, and that public money buys public value rather than ideologically driven pet projects that are so often captured by patronage and rent-seeking. I'm Michael Avery, and remember to follow us on X and wherever you get your podcasts. Take care.